Hello, everyone. We're gonna get started. It's 1:31, so we have a lot to discuss today. So we want to use a full 90 minutes of time together. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at the Making the Most of It, Maximizing Development in a Land Scarce City panel. My name is Bea de la Torre. I am the Managing Director for Housing and Homelessness at Trinity Church, Wall Street. And I'm here to really moderate an amazing discussion between all these professionals and really engage you in a dialogue on what we could do. As you all know, New York City is facing a homelessness crisis. Just tonight, there's going to be 64,000 people sleeping in the homeless shelter. Out of that, around 23,000 are children. In addition to that, there's roughly between 3,000 to 4,000 people living in the streets of New York. So the need for supportive housing is completely evident. We need so much more of it. In fact, the numbers I've seen is that for every 6 individuals that need it or households, there's only 1 unit available to them. So we really need to continue to produce as much as we can. In the meantime, we are basically living in a city with super high land costs. I don't need to tell you all that. And that's what we're going to discuss here, some strategies on how we can get around that and how we can really help support your work. And now we're in the midst of really implementing some really exciting things like the ESHI, the Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative, and New York 1515 for a combined 35,000 units. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to actually be doing this in a little bit of a different way. We're going to have more of a dialogue rather than solid presentations. And I definitely want to leave at the end a good amount of Q&A. So I'll leave at least like 25 minutes or so. So think about your questions because we really want to hear from you. But before we jump in, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists so they can briefly introduce themselves, say who they are, who they're representing, and then we'll dial into the discussion. So Theresa?
Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many faces in this room because we are certainly open for business and hoping to do more projects with you all. So my name is Theresa Cassano. I'm the director of the Supportive Housing Loan Program at New York City Housing Preservation and Development. We are one of the many loan programs at HPD that encompasses a supportive housing set-aside, and so really excited to talk to you all about the government perspective of land scarcity.
I'm Tony Shitemi, a principal of Urban Architectural Initiatives. We're architects working with for-profit and non-profit developers for more than 20 years. Very excited to be here and to talk to you.
My name is Mike McCarthy. I'm from Alembic Community Development. We are a developer and consultant here in New York and in New Orleans, and I'm excited to talk to you as well.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm David Cleghorn. I'm the Chief Housing Officer with Help USA. We develop permanent supportive housing in a number of states, and like everybody else, I'm excited to be here, but please bear with me. This is the first time I've been on a panel in New York with people that I work with. So normally I'm on panels with rooms full of strangers. So if I stumble, you'll know why. Thanks.
David, you're in for a treat. Okay, great. So let's start talking about private sites. We're going to talk about public sites later, but let's start with private. So land costs have been going up significantly. It's been very hard to procure sites in the private market. I first want to ask Theresa about a new tool that was recently launched, the Down Payment Assistance Fund, which is available for not-for-profits that are doing supportive housing initially and then eventually including others that are doing low-income housing. In order to be able to get that down payment in and lock in the site before they get to the acquisition fund. So Theresa, tell us why you think that tool is important, why the city decided to pull this together with many other foundations and philanthropic partners, and what impact do you think it's going to have?
Sure. Just by a show of hands, who has heard of the Down Payment Assistance Fund, RFQ? Okay, great. So I'm not talking to totally unfamiliar stakeholders here. Just as a little bit of background, Bea had mentioned that we have a goal to do 15,000 units over 15 years as a city. As we started to develop that goal, we pulled together a steering committee to sort of talk about what are the barriers, particularly for nonprofits, to be able to accomplish that goal and build more supportive housing. One of the strong recommendations that we got was that there is a moment between acquisition funding being available and a nonprofit needing to go to their board and put down a down payment on the site where there's no funding tools available. It's really coming out of the nonprofit's pocket. And so in collaboration with a bunch of folks, which I definitely want to name them, so Robin Hood, Charles Rebson Foundation, the Oak Foundation, Supportive Housing Network of New York, of course, thank you all, Enterprise, LISC, LIF, and Corporation for Supportive Housing, we launched the Down Payment Assistance Fund RFQ. And that RFQ was meant to create a list of nonprofit developers who do supportive housing to get on a pre-qualified list to have access to down payment assistance funding. For those of you who have worked with the New York Acquisition Fund, it's a similar set of people, not dissimilar due diligence processes, but essentially it's meant that you can go to any of those New York Acquisition Fund lenders when you're looking at sites, sort of do a quick vetting with HPD or other agencies. We're on the line to get you a response quickly so that you have access to down payment funding. So we think that's very important, A, for supporting our nonprofits, particularly in the supportive housing space, but also to sort of speed up the process and make it easier for you all to get your hands on capital. And so we're hoping that that helps us as we continue to increase production.
Theresa, so you mentioned that there was a round where groups got pre-qualified.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the future rounds for those that will be interested in tapping into it?
Sure. So this is a $4.75 million revolving loan fund. And so the idea is that this money will get paid back when you close on acquisition financing, whether it be through the New York Acquisition Fund or another acquisition fund source. And then HPD or whatever agency you are working for will take that out at your construction closing. So we want this to revolve and sort of be an opportunity that will last over time. In the first round, 19 nonprofits were qualified. In year one, we're really focusing on supportive housing to sort of meet the goals of both the city and state's commitment to supportive housing. In the future, though, we want this to continue to be a source for nonprofits, and so we will look at opening up this fund again and allowing more people to apply.
And I will just add that from a funding perspective, given that a big chunk of this is philanthropic funding, funders are really interested in seeing how this works. And I think if there's great demand, funders will come to the table. I can speak for myself or for my organization, and so that you have a bigger pool of funds to tap into. So it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out and how many loans end up being executed through it.
Yeah, if you're on the list, please keep looking for sites and give us a call if you have any bites.
Yeah, so that's actually a perfect segue because Help USA was one of the groups that was pre-qualified. So David, I'm going to turn it to you to talk a little bit about how you're thinking about using the fund and what you're doing.
Sure. Yeah. So we applied for the fund whenever that was, a year ago or so, and we're qualified. And it's really exciting news for a group like us because our board meets several times a year. It takes a lot of effort in some cases to get them all into the room together. So the timing of being able to source down payment money quickly without having to go to a full board approval is beneficial for us, and it really sort of starts to level out the playing field a little bit with the cash buyers. I think they're always going to be at an advantage because they can just purchase the property regardless of the appraised amount or any sort of timing. But we're working through an application right now on a site in the Bronx. We applied through LIF. I don't know if they're in the room. They're one of the intermediaries that are working on this program. And we got an appraisal, and the appraisal came back pretty quickly on a site that we were looking at. We haven't been able to agree on the seller hasn't agreed yet with the appraisal, which is not a surprise, and may never. So I don't know if we'll actually execute on that project. But it's been. It allowed us to get into the room with the seller, which is something that we typically in the past haven't been able to do, because if I had commissioned the appraisal on my own and then gone and said, tried to negotiate the sale, I wouldn't have access to, on a site that large, we wouldn't have had access to that much cash to put down without significant board approval, and it would be far too much that down payment would be far too much for our board to agree to. Even with the assurances from HPD and others that the project would be financed. So it's been a benefit to us, and we're really looking forward to using it more. And in fact, when I got a call the other day from and heard that we might not be able to agree on the price with the seller, I thought, okay, that's no big deal. We'll just go find another site, because we can go through this process again, and all we've lost so far is, I don't know, $4,000 on the cost of the appraisal. So it's exciting. It'd be more exciting if I could tell you that we closed on it. But I think we will. I think we'll find one. It might be this one. It might be another. One of the things I learned is, once we go through this process on the down payment money, then you can negotiate with your lender on the type of acquisition loan. So it can go through the New York City Acquisition Fund or a balance sheet loan with your lender. So that adds a little bit more flexibility too if timing is really a concern, and the costs are different, and all the players have to be involved in that decision. But the increased flexibility in this particular city, I think, is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think next year when we have this panel, we'll be able to say that you closed that deal and hopefully some other ones. So David, you were talking about how you go about finding a site generally, and I would love to ask both you and Mike to comment on this. How do you go about it? Do you go through brokers? Do you drive around the city?
So
How's that process?
We have different strategies depending on where we operate. So we operate in 5 or 6 different states. So depending on where we are, the strategy is different. But here in the city, we have typically relied mostly on cannibalizing our own property, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So we have some stuff that was built early on in our agency's history that had a lot of, well, at the time didn't, but now has a lot of excess land. But we are working with brokers, and we found a little niche working with for-profit developers on sites, on acquiring sites and having them be the junior partner in the deal. We did a project in the Bronx near Yankee Stadium that was done that way. These guys are very good at working with the sellers and getting the project under agreement, and we're good at financing and running the supportive housing, and so they get a little bit of fee, we get the site, and that's been successful. We'll be closing on another project like that later this year in the Bronx, hopefully. But as we are now going into sort of the second part of our strategic plan that we put into place a number of years ago to expand our permanent housing portfolio, we're going to have to open up more to brokers. And so having tools that allow us to have a conversation with a broker like the Down Payment Assistance Fund is really where we need to be right now. So we'll be doing more of that.
Mm-hmm. Mike, can you comment on that as well?
Yeah, so we access sites through a variety of different ways. We work with brokers. We get a lot of reach outs from brokers, so that involves a lot of sifting through things that are probably not going to ever happen, and having to make a decision as to whether you're going to pay attention to whether that's a feasible property or not. But I think it's better to turn things down and ignore things than to be constantly looking. So we definitely have worked with brokers, and we some of our nonprofit partners have found brokers that are really effective at finding these sites that are kind of tasked with that nonprofit's goal of developing X number of units in X number of years, and having kind of parameters for what they're looking for, what size sites they're looking for, and having a dedicated broker that understands those needs and the ability for the nonprofit to pay certain prices, and for these budgets for affordable and supportive housing projects to support it, I think has been very helpful. The other way that we access it too is that we're generally partner with a nonprofit, and sometimes with a for-profit as well. So having the grapevine of all of you is also very helpful, because some nonprofits or for-profit developers have access to sites that they don't know what to do with, or need assistance with it. They haven't developed in a long time, so we've been able to access it that way. I would say the other kind of newish avenue is through faith-based organizations that have they're property rich and maybe not have a lot of cash in their wallets, and they have underutilized sites that can be developed. and can be developed in a way that they may maintain their place of worship. That makes things a little bit more complicated, but it's a way of accessing sites in a variety of different neighborhoods, and yeah. So that I would say those are kind of the three ways that we're doing it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, finding this site is one thing, but then obviously doing the assessment and evaluating for feasibility is the next step. So, Tony, you're an absolute expert at doing that. How do you start that evaluation process? What are some of the key things that you look at initially? And also, what are things that are very quickly become red flags for you?
Gotcha. So I think the most important, and many of you here are also absolute experts, so it'll be interesting to hear what questions you have after. But the first thing to do is just observe what neighborhood it's in. Is there a subway line within 150 feet? Overhead lines, expressways have a lot of impact. Obviously, the location, as we all know, the Bronx is full of rock, which can impact the project. Now, it's not bad if you know ahead of time. It's terrible if you find out while you're in the ground. So, and the other thing is looking at just the adjacent buildings. Do they have basements? Do they have cellars? That can tell you a lot of what the probability of what your site is. It's not a guarantee. Because maybe your site is the one that had rock and the others didn't. One more thing that is a recent issue is the gas line moratorium that we're facing right now in a couple of buildings. Definitely if you're in the far-flung areas of any of the boroughs, it may be harder for you to have National Grid or Con Ed sign off. So the consequence of that is probably having to go to more expensive heating systems. But it's something that is very current that you definitely want to be aware of as you're selecting sites. Just one small factor, it's not always a disadvantage if you're next to the railroads. Zoning actually increases if you're doing heirs, a seniors residence, or if you're doing MIH or inclusionary housing. You could get, you're not getting FAR, but you're getting extra height. So if you have a site where you have floor area on the table, you can actually get a couple more floors, possibly even 3, depending on your configuration, if you're within 150 feet of an elevated expressway or train tracks. Then, of course, there's the geotech. As you're looking at sites, initially, obviously, anyone's loath to spend the $15,000 to $30,000, $35,000 to do a geotech report. But if there are new developments nearby, you may be able to get some information from the developers that they're willing to share, or even talking to the subsurface investigations company that worked with them. They have a lot of data, and they can give you a sense of what's going on there. And then finally, you have a site, you've looked at all these other factors, you really have to pay attention to the zoning. So you need to get a hold of your architect, have them do a quick evaluation to let you know whether you can actually do the number of units that you need. And as we know, a lot of the sites that are left are not the most desirable, they're not ideal, and so it becomes even more critical if you're needing the 60, 70 units to make a project viable. So you've got to really nail that part of it down.
Tony, 2 quick follow-up questions on that. So in terms of getting the services from National Grid and Con Ed, is there some sort of map that people can access to get a sense of within areas that will be
Yes. You want to start with your survey and see whether there are lines there, which is not necessarily a guarantee because you still have to put in your application to a National Grid. And based on their women fancy, they'll make a decision, but it's also something. Obviously, there are great economic issues that are impelling not increasing the pipelines, and it's become a little bit political as well.
Right.
The fact that you have a gas line right in front of your building does not necessarily mean that you'll get service. But it's really too early. It's really too early to say anything authoritative.
Okay. And then picking up on the politics, the other thing I wanted to ask is how much do you consider the political context, right? Especially if you're going to go for a rezoning at this point in terms of how friendly the community has traditionally been to this kind of housing.
I think we've all been up at the community boards. We've all gotten killed and castigated. So that's something that is part and parcel of what all of us do. And we just have to be upfront about the mission that we all serve. And the best thing that I've heard when I go to the community boards is that they is us. In other words, the clients that you're all serving are our family members. They're our friends. And so that's one aspect of it. Architecturally speaking, we've come a long way from we did some HUD 202s years ago, which were absolutely no frills. You know, we fought for every jog in the building, and we've come a long way to where the agencies, I'm saying that because Theresa's right next to me. I don't want to get hit.
I won't hold it against you.
The agencies have come around and are looking for buildings that the community's going to welcome. So it's made our work a lot easier in terms of coming to community boards, in terms of BSA, city planning. Our buildings are much more attractive than they used to be.
Mm-hmm. So then, Theresa, of course, it ultimately comes down to the financing, right, to get the project done. So what are the things you're looking for?
Sure. So there's a lot of overlap, which is great. And I will say Tony recently came to a design consultation with our architectural team, and it was the first time ever no one had any comments, and we all just sat there and looked at each other. So it's great. We have come a long way. We
got a lot of lumps.
The earliest thing that we really do think about is, like Tony said, you want to look at zoning. Just to be blunt, if you're doing new construction, anything under 50 units gets a little hard to work within the various new construction financing sources that are available from the city and state. So that's not a hard and fast rule, but if you are looking for some benchmarks, one to keep in mind. It is still rare on private sites that our sponsors are pursuing a rezoning, either through the Uniform Land Use Review process, ULURP, or BSA. Both of those involve community engagement, but more importantly for us as the lenders, they involve additional time and additional money. And so that's something we really want to think about with you before you assume that that is something you're pursuing. Tony also talked a lot about a general category that I'm going to lump into constructability. And so that can be anything from, are there environmental constraints on the site? So usually early on, you're getting a phase 1 that will indicate, are there any environmental conditions? If there are, that's something you probably want to build into your budget for pricing. Are there neighbors who need access agreements? Usually there's a cost associated with that. Is there rock, et cetera, et cetera? So those are things you want to think about. Another thing in constructability that we're seeing trips more people up is that all of the zoning bonuses that are available through things like AIRS and MIH are wonderful, but oftentimes that additional height triggers additional site safety requirements for DOB. And so just make sure that you are, if you can, talk to a GC early on and start thinking about what is the real cost of this project. Even buildings that have looked very vanilla to us have come in with bids that are much higher than we expected. So feasibility obviously is going to be a big one for us. We really want to see a budget or a shell of a budget very early on. And so as you're looking at a site, you should be thinking about putting that together, understanding that a lot of those numbers will be holds. One of the big things, and David, sort of indicated this, is appraisals. So that's something you want to get really, really early. HPD can only pay the lower of the appraised value or the purchase price. And so for us, that appraisal is a ceiling. But not every site works within our term sheets, just to be very honest with everyone. And so if you're seeing numbers that are in $90 a square foot, $100 a square foot, it's going to get very hard for you to finance a building on that site. Site history is something that people don't necessarily think about, but as you're looking at sites, I always recommend, if you can, go into ACRIS, which has the city's public records, and just make sure that there's no stray old restriction on that building. Sometimes we find those much later in the development process when unwinding those can be a cost and sort of a constraint to what you can develop. So it's a good thing and an easy thing for you to check early. And then finally, the community engagement piece. So for my loan program, the supportive housing loan program, we still do ask that you go to the community board for every project. We do not necessarily require support, but you all are our best ambassadors for supportive housing. And trust me, I have been at those community meetings where you get thrown rotten tomatoes all over you and you hear, why are you here? Can't you build this elsewhere? I know it's hard. I know it's a big ask, but it is so, so important that you continue to be the face of supportive housing, inviting people into your buildings, telling them these stories, because without that sort of support, we can't grow supportive housing in the city. So we appreciate your efforts. And just one other plug, if you are going to the community board, it's very helpful to come talk to HPD and really come talk to Shinny. You might be going on the same night as someone else and not know about it, and really that can sort of trip you up in ways that you don't plan for. So good to give folks a heads up when you're planning on making those outreach efforts.
So in terms of actually contacting HPD, what's the best way of going about it, Theresa? Do they just email you directly?
Yeah, so everybody emails me directly about sites all the time, but there are a variety of loan programs at HPD. You know, we really do have a rolling open door policy. The state does have formal applications, but in general, whether you're working with the city or the state, the doors are pretty open, and we say as soon as you're looking at a site, reach out to us so we can give you a temperature check of yes or no. David talked about his down payment assistance fund site. You know, for us, it was really helpful that he reached out to us pretty much at the same time as reaching out to the fund. And so we could vet the site and say, yes, as soon as you are ready to go and have a yes from the seller, we have a commitment letter waiting for you. And so we'll have those conversations pretty frankly with everyone if you bring us those sites.
Okay. So at the end of the panel, if you don't have Teresa's email, you can come up and ask her for it.
Yes, please.
Great.
Can I just add one thing to the site selection process that I probably forgot to mention on our prep calls? Mm-hmm. One thing that I think is important and often gets overlooked, especially if you're going to build supportive housing, is the access to the services for the residents that are ultimately going to live in the building. So if you're going to build a project that's going to have a set aside for 60% of the units to be chronically homeless, mentally ill adults that have been living on the street or in shelter, and you build a building on top of a big hill, how are they going to get up and down the hill? Things like that. So, and if the site, including in the zoning analysis, that the site has appropriate enough space in the building to have the supportive service space that you really need to do to deliver quality supportive services. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Thank you for bringing it up, David. So, okay, so we talked about private sites, right? Lots of challenges, but still lots of opportunity. HPD very willing to look at the sites to see if they're feasible. The other stock is the public land, and I know there's not as much left. I know that for a fact. I used to work at HPD working on that portfolio, but there is still some left. So can you talk a little bit, Theresa, about sort of like how HPD thinking about how to utilize that land and how it relates to supportive housing development?
Sure. So we do have a rolling pipeline of RFPs and RFQs, and often partner with other agencies such as NYCHA to post those. So those are all available on our website. Most typically, when we release an RFP, a request for proposals, we do not specify a term sheet or a housing program. And so we've actually seen a lot of success in the past few years of supportive housing providers applying for those RFPs and getting them. I do know that, that cost-wise and sort of capacity-wise can pose some constraints for folks. So the other thing that we've seen is that in a larger assemblage, a supportive housing provider would partner with a team, potentially of for-profits, and do one building or a portion of the building as supportive. And so, one of the great success stories we're seeing there is in the Bronx Chester RFP, which was released several years ago. There's a supportive housing building going up, and I'm looking at breaking ground right now. It's a beautiful building. It's part of a larger assemblage, and actually of that campus, it will be the first building that is complete. So we're excited about that. The other opportunity, a very long time ago, some of you may remember in 2013, we had released a supportive housing RFQ. The rationale of that being that oftentimes in these RFPs, it costs a lot of money and takes a lot of effort for nonprofits to apply. So we wanted to create this pre-qualified list of supportive housing providers. So thus far, we've actually designated 11 sites through that RFQ and continue to look at redesignating as the years go on. One of those is complete and opened, 5 are under construction, and the rest are in development. And so that's a tool that we will continue to use going forward.
So is the RFQ, it's closed, right? Do you plan to open it up again?
It is currently closed. We don't have immediate plans, but it is certainly something we are considering. Obviously, we know the demand to build is very large, and so sort of thinking about how do we target some of the smaller sites that might be appropriate for supportive to the right people is something we continue to think about.
And then the last follow-up for you, Theresa, in terms of, so one thing is vacant land, and another thing is looking at co-locating with other municipal buildings. So how are you all thinking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're certainly combing with our partner agencies what's available. The supportive housing RFQ was originally released with NYCHA and Health and Hospitals, and there's lots of opportunities to look for other collaborations. Many of those RFQ sites are actually on Health and Hospitals campuses or on NYCHA campuses, and so we'll continue to look at opportunities to develop with other agencies as well.
I will put a plug in for the public library system, 207 public libraries, many of which have great capital needs, and this will be a fantastic opportunity, so something to think about. So Theresa, you referenced that it's expensive to respond to RFPs, and Mike and David know that very well. So can you please talk about how you approach, when you look at an RFP that's being issued, what cost-benefit analysis you go through in order to decide if you are going to incur into the expense of applying, especially since you know that even if you're awarded the site, you're still going through a very lengthy pre-development process, given that it includes the public review. So maybe, David, you want to start?
Sure. So we've responded to our fair share of RFPs that have come out over the past few years. Not all of them, though. When I first came to help in 2012, we didn't have a pipeline of development, so there I was kind of chasing everything. And we were probably fortunate not to get a couple of those in retrospect. But what we look at now generally is first and foremost, is this something that we can do on our own? If it's one of the next gen RFPs or something that's very, very big, then obviously the answer is no, and we would then seek to look and find a partner, a development partner to work with. And for us, that means essentially having a real role in that development. So if we're going to partner with a for-profit developer on a RFP response, basically, usually what we say is we'll take care of the supportive services at the site, but you're going to give us a building pad, and we're going to build that building. We're going to own it, and it's not going to be. We're not going to give you part of the developer fee. It's our building, and we manage that building. And so we've done that a couple times. We're building a building in Brooklyn now on Livonia Avenue next to 2 railroad tracks. That was an RFP that HPD did a number of years ago, and that's sort of what we look at on the bigger RFPs. On the smaller RFPs, we look at really the site itself and how it would fit for our model of supportive housing. How much space is there? Can we do supportive services there? Is the neighborhood one that's going to accept a supportive housing project? And what the capacity is of the project management staff that I have to work on these things, and generally what the cost will be. So I think that's probably not really any different than what anybody else does when it comes to reviewing an RFP. And we are now being a little bit more selective in what we respond to, just because it does take a lot of time. And I'll be very honest, I've participated on some very large RFP responses where you had the big giant national developers as the lead, and I would recommend, if you're a nonprofit, doing that at least once or twice, because you get into the room with those folks and see how they think about projects and think about sites and think about deals. Sometimes you cringe and you get a little nervous when they start talking about supportive housing as like another bell or a whistle. But when they're talking about really how to put together a massive site, you can learn a lot. So that's something else that we actually look at as sort of a staff development tool.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I also want to mention that the Supportive Housing Network has a series of tools that also help as you negotiate JV partnerships and other things with larger developers. So I'm sure you know about them, but if you don't, definitely check in because I think they're very helpful. Mike, from your perspective, when you're looking at the RFPs, what are the things that you're looking at in that cost-benefit analysis?
I mean, yeah, I think it's similar to what David is looking at. We're a small shop, so one of the things is just capacity. Like, do we have time to dedicate a lot of time and some financial resources to responding to something? So there's a lot of things that we end up passing on. There's not really a magic formula for what we choose to go after and what we don't. I will say that there was a period of time where it seemed like we went after things, and I got this feedback from other developers that they were being awarded to kind of the same people over and over again, and I do think that has changed. So that's been great, and we're actually working on 3 projects right now that we got through RFPs with NYCHA, with the public library, and all with HPD. So that's been a really positive thing, and it's definitely changed my attitude toward RFPs. So yeah,
it's worth it now.
If you get an award, they're great.
I mean, I will say, though, just keep in mind, if you do get that award, most times when we do dispositions of city-owned sites, you go through something called a ULURP, which many of you know of, but that is a public process that on paper takes 7 months. In reality, you're probably doing a lot of legwork for a year or a year and a half before that 7-month clock even starts. And so when we talk about capacity, it's not only actually putting together the RFP, it's doing all of the follow-up that's going to be required before you even get into pre-development.
That's right. And lots of those meetings that you referenced earlier.
So many meetings.
Yeah, but leading to great outcomes. Okay, so Tony, so in terms of the RFPs, right, you usually get a developer calling you and saying, come on as part of the team and help respond. I know it's a developer-driven process. So from a designer architect's standpoint, what are you looking for in a team in order to decide if you're going to be part of it? And what do you think makes a relationship better so that you can all put together the best response possible?
Gotcha. So we're always grateful to be asked to the dance. So the design part, by our observation on most RFPs, is about 25 points or so. So it's pretty significant. Not as significant as the finances, obviously, but it's pretty important. And so we have to take that seriously. Internally, our key is just we have to demonstrate that we understand what all the parties want. The basic items, which include just nailing down the unit needs that the agencies want, that we're meeting their subscription, that handicap accessibility is being met, and very importantly, and good for this day and age, even the sustainability. We really have to address those in the RFP. Now, another critical item that's basic is working out the unit mix to make sure that the RFP is financially viable. I know you all know this, but it takes a very strong team with good communication. We're fortunate enough for CSD Development and Mike, along with Well Life, Sherry and Crystal, and Federation have asked us to join them, and we've successfully managed to get a few of those. And there's a lot of back and forth and communication that we're doing, making adjustments between the studios, the ones, the twos, all of that to get the right mix so that there's a good balance. And also with Alembic, we haven't done an RFP with you, David, but hopefully in the future.
We got to talk about capping the fee on the RFP question.
So then beyond the basic items, and again, it's all about demonstrating this in the RFP. The creative items are obviously active design, which you do with your landscaping. If you're able to have exercise rooms, we actually have one building with a, I don't want to say it's a jogging path for liability reasons, but it's a walkway on the rooftop. So
I won't tell DOB.
Right. So you really have to just show all those ideas and bring them out so that they're very visible and anyone can see them. And you have to be very efficient, of course, because cost is a factor. We're obviously not working in a vacuum. So there's a lot more, obviously, that goes in. It's what I would say to you, it's a ton of time. Don't take it lightly. And talking about costs, from our end, obviously, we can spend a heck of a lot. But I would say, on average, it's between $15,000 to $25,000 for an RFP, and it can go higher than that depending on what you want.
Okay. Well, I think we all learned a new term today: walkway of a rooftop. I'm gonna definitely be using that. Theresa, what are the next RFPs coming out of HPD? What should we expect?
Oh my! So we have such a rolling pipeline, Bea. It really, we are putting out about 5 RFPs every month at this point, so I would recommend you stay posted. NYCHA also has a very robust pipeline of RFPs. If some of you who do senior housing might be interested in checking them out as well. And then again, like I mentioned, we're looking for further collaborations with health and hospitals, and so excited to keep developing very creative sites that try to bridge that sort of supportive, as well as folks who are cycling through the health and hospital system to serve the needs of both their clients and people who are in shelter.
Okay, so all the information on the HPD website, check it regularly, very active. Okay, so we talked about private sites, we talked about public sites. The other thing that the developers are doing, and the not-for-profits, is to look at their own portfolios, right, in terms of how they can maximize what they have. So David, I'm going to start with you because you had already referenced some projects in that regards. And I know you have a couple slides that maybe you want to go through, but can you talk about what Help USA has been doing in terms of looking at your own portfolio and the opportunities there?
Yeah, I mean, it's really been a two-pronged approach, one of which is just simply not going to be available to a lot of organizations if they don't have the land to start with. But as a shelter provider and operator, we built a number of shelters back in the late 80s and early 90s that, by today's standards, aren't coming close to using all of the FAR on a site, but at the time were in neighborhoods that nobody was really building in. So that's one approach. And then what might be more, obviously, if you've been developing for some time, then you have your renovations of your own year 15 properties. We've done a number of projects in the last couple of years that have been using our own property. We have a property on 14th Street, or 13th Street. I don't know why I said 14th Street. 13th Street in Union Square that we built in the early 90s that had a lot of had a Head Start program in it. And as the neighborhood changed, that neighborhood became pretty much a rich neighborhood. And then Universal Pre-K started a number of years ago. It kind of ended that Head Start program, and they had to leave. And so in that case, we went and we worked with LISC to renovate the building using a NYSERS loan, and we fit out the first 3 floors of the building for our offices. So we went from spending like $1 million a year in generic space downtown to $500,000 a year in a mortgage in our own space, and also renovated the 90 apartments without any additional public money. But that did not stop HPD from extending our regulatory agreement until 2250 or something. So, but that's okay, because we're a mission-based group, we didn't mind. We also, we're in construction now on a project in the Bronx that was built on a parking lot that one of our shelters had. So we had to kick out one of our social service programs, and that was a homeless prevention program. They went and found additional space, and then we're building 84 apartments there that's through the SARA program that is for seniors, and that'll be marketed to LGBT seniors in the Crotona Park neighborhood. But the big thing we're working on now, what do I do, this arrow?
Yep.
Is first I got to go through other people's slides.
We'll go back to those.
So this is in East New York, Brooklyn. We have a number of projects there. This was a shelter that we built in 1987 or something. It's built like a roadside motel that you would see in real America somewhere, and its back is to the street. It's intended to be protective. It was also built at a time when the political powers that be really, honestly, and for goodness, thought that by 2019 there would be no more homeless crisis. So it wasn't built to really still be here. We owned it, and then we didn't own it, and but we've operated it the whole time through various deed restrictions, and not really sure why some of those things were set up the way they were, but they were. So the plan here is that we're going to take this shelter and turn it into that. So what this is we're in ULURP now. My first time going through ULURP, so Theresa's right. I think you gotta go to your therapist and take some medicine or have a drink, but it's been a long and arduous process. But we actually are in it now. We're meeting with community board next week. Hopefully they'll be voting on this. But what you see is at the front end of the slide is a new shelter. It's a new purpose-built shelter. So it's replacing the 200 units of shelter that were there. It's difficult to explain quickly, but basically we're scaling down the same size shelter by putting it into a bigger building. So we're going to have two entrances, one that'll be open 24 hours, one that'll be open during the busy time of the day. Most of the services will occur in the middle of the building. So basically we're taking a 200-unit building, cutting it into 50-unit pods, and the social service staff will be working with those families. And then that frees up the rest of the block for permanent housing. So the orangey looking buildings are, and the one on the far end is an Ella building. That's the courtyard. The reason we have a hill is there's one, and this goes to sort of the site stuff, there's one building that we don't own that's on the corner. When whatever was here before was torn down, they excavated to build our shelter, but in the existing courtyard there now is just rubble. So instead of underpinning the neighboring building, we're building a hill. Well, it's actually not building a hill. We're excavating below the hill, but I think that's going to be the central point of the courtyard for the kids that live there. These are just more pictures of what it looks like now. Oh no, that's the parking lot where we're building that. So we're leveraging that project in East New York into two Ella buildings that'll be about, I always forget the total number. Laura's in the room somewhere, she could tell you. And then, how much? 255, and then a supportive building of 72 units. So we'll be working on this for the next couple years. Fortunately for us, we have two more sites like this that are located in the Bronx. We started with this building, even though it's the most complicated one, because the existing building itself is in such a state of disrepair. And since, if any of you are homeless shelter operators, you understand when you don't own the property, everything has to go through Department of Homeless Services. So capital improvements are really difficult to make quickly because it has to go through it has to end up going through OMB for approvals. So we're going through ULURP because the city's going to give us back the land and for all the zoning changes. And then we'll do this again. And this will then, from my point of view, from the growth proportion for help, this then puts us in the category of being able to, in a few years, apply to some of those RFPs that come out without a for-profit partner, because we'll have the size and scale development that we need. So if you're going to mass up and do this stuff as a supportive housing developer, and if you can find the sites large enough, the other things that you should think about is your financial standing, your liquid assets, your net assets, things that the investors are going to look for. So we've been, for the last couple of years, trying to increase those accounts so that when we get down to getting ready to close at the last minute, somebody doesn't say, hey, you know what, you need to go get a partner. So there's a lot into it. I don't want to take up too much time. We could talk forever about this after. It's been our life for the last couple of years. But this has been an opportunity for us. And then we're also working with some other organizations that have excess land to do similar kind of things but as a partnership with them.
David, I'm curious what the community's, approach was to these projects, given that you were already there. What are they saying? They don't know.
So we are already there. We have a 150 unit permanent housing building that was built in the early 90s that we renovated about a year ago, $24 million renovation. That building had, back in the early days, HCR did not require any kind of reserves, evidently, and the building had some problems. And HPD, HCR, and help, we were able to renovate it. That has restored some of the goodwill we have with the community. We have another 150 units across the street that's focused on homeless vets and survivors of domestic violence. For the most part, we've met with the community board several times on this already, just preliminarily, and we have not really received very much pushback in the sense of, why are you citing a shelter in our neighborhood because it's already there? So the main concern, which we were surprised by, that people had, and it comes up over and over, is what's going to happen to the people that are living in the shelter right now? Where are they going to go? What's going to happen to those children? Which there's an answer to that question. And so we haven't had a lot of pushback. Now, we have had some other challenges at the political level that has nothing to do with residents in the neighborhood, but has to do with history that predates anybody that works at HELP. But if you Google HELP USA and look at who our founder was, and Google the assembly member in that district, you can probably put two and two together.
Okay. Assignment for after the panel.
But in general, normal people, like regular,
Right.
everyday folks, we've had a lot of support,
Okay,
or they don't care.
That's great to hear. It's really traumatizing to see what's happening with the siting of shelters all over the city. So I'm glad to hear that, given that there's already a shelter, they're not pushing back on that, and that they're accepting, as we all should be, right? Tony, let me ask you, how often do you work on projects like this in terms of looking at the assets of the not-for-profits, and how do you approach it from a technical standpoint? Are they harder than some of the other projects that you work on, and what are some of the things that should be considered?
As David's telling his at the tail that Help USA is going, just dawning on me sitting here, and Alan, one of my partners sitting out there, is working on a project very similar to that, where a shelter site is being leveraged to keep the shelter and also have permanent housing. So it's if any of you have property like that, it's definitely something to consider. Most of the other sites that we have are have excess development area. They have parking lots, they have side yards, or they just have extra FAR. And actually, let me just go back to the earlier slides there. So, whoops, where's the?
I can help you from here.
Okay.
You got it?
Just trying to zip it through fast. So it all comes back to the zoning again. If you suspect that you might have excess area, it's worth checking out. So this is a site in the Bronx. And is there? Can we go back one?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Then that's the first
that's
slide.
the first.
Okay. So what you're looking at there, very faintly on the top left, is the one property. And the gray area at the top is currently a parking lot. This was a HUD 202 building. And so the top photo on the right is a side yard. They've got about a 35 foot side yard. And then the next picture, you can see the parking lot at the rear. What we were able to find out for this client is that they can actually add a 7-8 story building in the 35 yard sliver. And at the rear, they can add almost an 80-90 unit building. So that's one of the things that they're able to do. Probably not everyone is this fortunate, but to some extent or the other, it might be possible. And so that's just a typical floor of the smaller building. Now here they were also exploring the possibility of just extending their existing building. However, because of the finances with HUD, that would be a more difficult financial model. And so they were sticking to something easier. Now here also a HUD 202 parking lot that you see with a big X in it, and there we're able to add about 30 units or so, 38 units. One thing about this building, I was talking about no-frills buildings earlier. One thing about this building is that we're also able to add introduce a elevator to it, so that's just improving it. So it's definitely worth checking out any sites that you own that might have extra floor area. And in our experience, the biggest obstacles are really financial. And I can't speak too much to this other than you're all the experts, other than to say that due to various financial obligations that have to be fulfilled, it may not be able to, you might not be able to develop that property until proper arrangements are made. But it's something worth exploring.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tony. Mike, I'm going to ask you this question to get your advice. So some of the not-for-profits maybe some of them haven't developed for a while, and they're starting to think about getting back in and seeing what they could do. What would be your advice to them in terms of getting back in development, or just starting to develop, for the first time in potentially a while? What would you say?
One of the things I would say is something that that David said earlier, which is kind of adding yourself to a team of people that have been doing it more recently and kind of going along and learning that way. Maybe they're not an owner in the property, but they're providing the services, and that's an opportunity to kind of have a seat at the table and follow along. I would also say, this is probably not the most original advice, but surrounding yourself with people that do know what they're doing is a very important thing. So using your resources here at Shitemi, asking around, getting kind of the feel for people that you might want to be working with, I think is really important, because we have a ton of really talented people in our field, and some are better at certain things than others are. So getting a feel for who knows what they're doing and who actually has a track record of getting things done. Who has a building that you can actually go and physically see and see how it's being run, and get those stories about how they got there. I think is another important thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to open it up for questions after I ask Theresa this question, so start thinking about what you want to ask. So Theresa, what other trends are you seeing? We talked again about public sites, private sites, development of their own assets. What other things do you want to bring up that folks here should be thinking about?
Sure. So we did talk about it a little bit, but the co-location of shelter and housing, we call that our home stretch model, and that's sort of thinking about, are there places where there are underbuilt shelters or new shelters potentially that you're building that you might want to co-locate with permanent housing, whether that be supportive housing or another program. So that's certainly something that we are encouraging people to think about. In general, on private sites, we've seen architects get very, very creative about ways to maximize FAR, and so we've thrown around this term AIRS, that stands for Affordable Independent Residences for Seniors. Essentially, you commit to set aside 20% of your floor area to people who are 62 and older, and that gives you a zoning boost. And so that's something we've definitely seen a lot in supportive housing. The caveats I will mention here that we typically don't like to see that overlaid with the supportive units, just because by zoning, those people have to be 62 and older, and I hope that we get to a place where we do not have people who are 62 and older in shelter. We're not quite there, but we want to make sure that we're complying with that restriction. Additionally, we are not really seeing seniors who earn 60% AMI in these buildings, which is a typical income limit for my term sheet. And so we would expect you to underwrite those units to a much lower rent. So you're sort of trading the zoning density for lower rents there. But oftentimes that actually is the tipping point of what makes projects feasible. So it's something to think about. And in general, just MIH or VIH, those tools have been around for a while, but we are certainly seeing them incorporated in supportive housing across the board. And then just one more thing on the existing portfolio. You know, we talked a lot about looking at your sites to see if you have excess FAR. We are also really interested in working with you on preserving your sites, even if you can't build more. And so I'll just make a plug for our preservation panel at 3. Many of you started developing before tax credits were even available, and you have old buildings that don't have that year 15 check-in. And those buildings have capital needs. So we would love you to help us make those buildings stay affordable. We can give you capital. We can work with you to find rental assistance or additional service funding in order to make sure that you can fulfill your mission to keep those buildings affordable. And so just encourage you to think about that and look in your portfolio for that as well.
Thank you, Theresa. On Homestretch, they coordinate through you, not DHS, right? If they are interested in
So you can
co-location?
come to whomever you'd like first. We have a really great working relationship with DHS. We'll connect pretty quickly to each other, and then DHS, HPD, and you as the sponsor will sit down and meet and figure out what the best plan is for the site.
Okay, great. Okay, so we have about 30 minutes for questions. So, yes. So the question is, I'm just going to repeat the question because we're taping this, is why wouldn't we build or assume that there's going to be seniors in the shelter? My understanding is that Theresa was just expressing a hope that in the future there wouldn't be seniors in shelter, just like we hope that there's no homelessness at all. But I'll let Theresa
Yeah, so let me clarify. We are certainly serving seniors in all of our supportive housing units, so I did not mean to imply that we are not building for seniors. Because of heirs, you specifically have to restrict certain units in perpetuity to be for folks who are 62 and older. And so typically when we see that restriction, we don't want to overlay it with another service award that may require not only that you be in a shelter, but you also be chronically homeless and have a diagnosis, et cetera. And so what we're typically seeing in my loan program would be a building where 60% of the units are supportive, 20% are reserved for low-income seniors from the community, and another 20% or so are marketed from the community. That is not to say that seniors are not eligible for every single unit in that building. It's just that extra zoning restriction that we don't necessarily want to overlay too much because, you know, some of you know in New York 3, you know, we had a lot of preferences and set-asides, and you know, we had these buildings where you had to be an LGBTQ veteran with one eye, and, you know, we're careful about the overlays.
Right. Yeah, it's just to streamline it, right? Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. Other? And don't be shy if you want to come up to the mic. Thank you. That way I don't have to repeat the question.
Hi, Greg Marr from the Leviticus Fund. Tony, I had a question for you about the intersection between zoning law knowledge and architects. Because architects generally are not attorneys. As you've emphasized, as really all of you have emphasized, there's a lot at stake in terms of zoning and zoning knowledge at the front end in terms of what's possible. So what would you recommend to a nonprofit or for-profit that wants to assure itself that an architectural firm has the right capacity to not miss something? And part of the reason I'm asking is because we just made a commitment on a pre-development loan to a group, which I won't name, in Brooklyn on a non-housing deal, and there was something major that was missed, which is causing them a lot of problems. So.
Yeah, that's any architect's nightmare, any developer's nightmare. That's the worst scenario to have. Definitely, it was said earlier in an earlier panel, you definitely want to have the right team at the table, and that team includes a land use lawyer. We often work with other land use lawyers. Dare I say the names, Sheldon Lobel's office is excellent, but there are many others that provide that service. We internally do a peer review of all the zoning that we do, and we even send out to not land use lawyers, but zoning consultants to review our work. Because we know we never want that nightmare scenario to occur. I can't say it any better than you said it. That's the worst scenario to ever happen.
Other questions? I know you got them. Yes, sir.
A question for Tony. How do you sort of compromise between the budgets that you're facing and the principles of universal design, especially when you're looking for people to age in place or wheelchairs accessible doors, etc.?
Right. I've been doing this maybe 20, 25 years or so, and it's been I've seen the code change. Before, HPD didn't want us to, what are VRFs? What's all this, environmental stuff you're putting in? Hey, those resistance, and now we're mandated to do it. So the code, the agencies are really catching up with where we need to be. Beyond that, and I think almost I see a few of other architects who are in our field here, we can't let the budget restrict our creativity. We're building, in your mission, your buildings are part of the tool that you use for healing, for building lives, for recovery. And the work that we do has to support that in our use of materials, in creating an attractive facade that folks want to come to. So it's mission critical, not only for your agencies, but for us. And so that's what we're looking to do. It's and just back to the site issues, the rock. We didn't talk about water. All those issues are affecting the budget, and to the extent that you know them ahead of time, you can control your budget in the best manner that way, so that the fewer surprises you have when you've started, the better.
I'll say, on the design side, right? Good design doesn't mean that it's always going to be more expensive. You just have to be smart about it. And then also the technology has advanced so much in terms of the materials, right? That you're finding probably a better balance of cost.
It's going to be more expensive, but it's you're talking about 3%, 4%, 5% to make the difference. And then, as we all know, it's been a very busy time for the season. So what we've seen is construction costs rise. Mechanical contractors, good mechanical contractors are difficult to find. Electrical contractors are scarce. When your favorite general contractors are telling you, I can't get my favorite guys here, and they get someone else whose number is higher. That's what we're facing. So in terms of cost, it's been very tough. It's been very tough. And I remember when we did a HUD 202 for $110 a square foot way back when.
Wow.
and that's really changed. And then obviously the prevailing wage issue wasn't as critical back then. It's critical right now.
Yeah. We could have a whole panel all day to talk about that. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Tony, on the slide you showed with the addition to the HUD project, do you have any sense of how hard or difficult it was to get HUD permission to add on, and who the funding source was?
So now I will, if I said anything on that, I'd be straying out of my area of expertise. I'll say that none of those have materialized yet. They are we're doing renovations in both those buildings, and we're just on the cusp of completing those renovations, at which point I believe HUD will reevaluate whether to release those sites for use or not. But probably the financial consultant for that client would have a better answer for you than me.
Just jumping in, though, if you are considering redeveloping a HUD 202, that is amazing, and we would totally support that. However, I would really caution you, check the restrictions, because in New York City in particular, we've seen they are all over the map. You might have an HPD restriction on top of a HUD restriction. You might have a state restriction. So just make sure you're doing a thorough inventory of what was signed on that building when, to figure out if that land is actually developable.
Okay. Other questions? Yes. Let me just repeat the question real quick to make sure everyone heard it. So it's about the home stretch model, and the efficiencies that are gained by co-locating the shelter with the permanent housing.
Yeah, so we use co-location as a pretty loose term. It could be a campus, like the version that you saw on David's slideshow. It could be an actual building that is combined. Typically, we're expecting to see some construction efficiencies in terms of cost, but I think one of the real benefits is also a service efficiency. And so, there are different models where there are different entrances, where you turn right for the shelter, left for the housing. There might be shared programming space. And so those are all opportunities that we're looking to leverage, but really will vary by the provider and what sort of service model and design they're looking to choose.
And then Theresa, in terms of the other thing that makes that model work really well is the guarantee from DHS that you have a long-term contract of 20 years plus. Is that part of the sort of like the term sheet?
Yeah, absolutely. So the financing is actually pretty vanilla from what you've seen. So typically what we're doing these days is there's a housing condo and a shelter condo. The benefit, as Bea mentioned, was having a 20-year contract on the shelter model. And so you can actually get a lender to underwrite to that, which is really great. On the housing side, we are leveraging a variety of HPD programs and also looking to potentially use 501c3 bonds from HDC for the shelter, which could also be a cost savings.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Other questions? Yes.
This is a question for Tony and Mike. Much has been said about the promise of modular or factory-built housing for multifamily construction. Do you think that this has a role to play in supportive housing?
So the question is about modular and the role it can play in supportive housing.
We haven't developed anything with modular housing. We've used a panelized system, so it's kind of like modular light in that it's just the walls as opposed to the pods. And we had a really great experience with that with a group called Island out in Long Island. So we are very original. I think that was a good entree into that because I've also been kind of skeptical of the of modular housing and kind of wanted to let some other people figure it out first. But from what I can tell and from talking to other developers, I think that the product is improving and I think a lot of the kinks are being worked out. So I would definitely talk to the other developers that have actually built something with it, but we are much more open to it at this point.
We've looked at a couple of projects using modular. The problems we encountered were those of scale, that you really need a large development to be able to get the economy of scales. For them to tool their shop and just produce enough. That's one of the issues. The other issue is getting in the pipeline, the timing of the pipeline. As we all know, our projects often get delayed due to all the hurdles, and if you miss timelines in a modular system, there's another job in place that's going to run for 3 or 4 months or 6 months, so they might not come back to you. And then lastly, in our reviews, the modular buildings are taller. So you're building your structure and plopping the pods on there. And as we all know, the height is very critical. If you want to get that extra floor, you're saving every square foot that you can. So those are some of the reasons that we haven't, I think the folks we've worked with have not fully gone in that direction.
Theresa, are you getting people coming to you with modular proposals?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. HPD actually has an RFVI because we are trying to understand more about the modular world as well and interested in exploring it more. We have done one supportive housing project that was modular a few years ago, and that was a good trial run. I think there's something to be said for if you have an all-studio building. There are some sort of regularities and benefits that can come out of modular, but as other folks have said, I think it's still in the exploratory phases, and so we haven't seen recent proposals coming in with modular construction.
Okay.
If I can just add, one project we did used bathroom modules. So I think you're able to do that with bathrooms or kitchens And that's a different approach that mitigates risk. And talking about all the negative side, I think the positive side is just control of the quality of production. And then also, if you're a prevailing wage job, the factory process is all union. So it does solve some problems.
We modeled one recently for an RFP response, and really the cost savings that we're told is going to be there is primarily on the construction loan because of the time savings. But the time savings isn't so significant that a typical New York City project getting delayed by something or other wouldn't eat into that right away. So when we actually modeled it, we modeled it as if it was a typical construction loan. So I'm skeptical at this point too. I think there's probably some kinks that still need to be worked out.
Yes, sir.
This is for Theresa.
Hi.
So we've heard a lot about sites in Bronx, and some in Brooklyn, and so forth. What about Manhattan, Queens? What has your experience been? Have you seen anything start to turn? Where we're going up 110th Street, 125th Street down, and where in Queens have you found that there's more activity?
The question is about sites in Manhattan and Queens and where there's more activity that's coming through HPD.
Sure. So to be honest, most of the Manhattan sites that we are building are RFP sites because there's so few land opportunities available, or preservation. So we do have a healthy amount of preservation work that we are doing in Manhattan. In Queens, there's a lot of activity in areas with higher density, so around Jamaica, and we're also starting to see some interest in Astoria, but most of the time the limiting factor in Queens, while we would like to say it's community opposition, is really zoning. And so while we're encouraging you guys to look for sites, that is the constraint that I've most often seen when people are bringing us sites from Queens.
Okay. And then in Manhattan, just to put another plug to co-location, because it's smart urban planning, and I think that's where a lot of the opportunities could still come up.
Absolutely.
Yep. Other questions? Yes.
Underwriting aside, for something like a 70-unit building where you can fulfill your 50 units of supportive, is HPD more interested in seeing 100% supportive projects or projects that meld supportive with community units?
So the question is HPD more interested in seeing buildings that are 100% supportive or ones that mix with community units as well?
So I think speaking beyond HPD, most of the service awards are actually looking for integration of community units as well as supportive units, and so that is most frequently what we are seeing. On smaller sites, there are situations where we have considered and done 100% supportive, but it's sort of up to you as the provider to explain how you're going to make sure that your building is very integrated into the community if you're doing that.
And then Theresa, for the ones that are a mix, are you still using the 50-unit threshold, or do you have more flexibility there, given that the family units obviously are larger?
The 50-unit threshold is sort of the minimum of what we can make work. Obviously, if you go up from that, it only makes it more feasible. And so, I think generally speaking, when you're looking at small sites, we can get a little bit creative with you, but that's where we're seeing sort of smaller units, maybe a different mix of supportive and low income than you would see in our typical 60-40 model.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Given the challenges of climate change that we're facing, are there any are programs given guidance to avoid certain flood zones, or are there certain types of architectural resiliency measures that are expected to be built in?
So I'll jump in first and just talk a little bit about the code. So, based on the building code and sort of our restrictions, we are very careful about building in flood zones. So not only do you have to disclose that, but your design has to incorporate considerations of those flood zones. We are very interested in building green buildings, which do take into account some of the climate change. So what roof interventions can you do? I don't know, Tony, if you have other thoughts on that.
I don't have too much more. We're doing some buildings in Far Rockaway that have to take that into account with respect to flooding. We're lucky enough that those sites are not in the floodplain. So we haven't had to deal too much with it. But one thing that's happened across the board, you can see all the boiler rooms are going up on the roofs. More buildings are getting emergency generators. So again, I think the force of nature is making us all respond in a way that'll give us more resilient buildings.
Other questions? Well, while you think about the next question, I mean, we know that the next superstorm Sandy will come at some point, right? So we absolutely have to be very responsible in building to make sure that we don't see the same issues that we saw last time. Okay, any other questions? We have time for 2 more. Okay, back there.
You were all feverishly writing about your zoning and special status basically for seniors. Could you just say a little bit more maybe about that program and also just an example?
So the question is just to provide more information about the set-asides for seniors and provide an example. I think.
Okay, so I think your question's directed to me. So about 3 or 4 years ago, the zoning was changed to create incentives for developers to create more affordable, to create more senior units. And in the zoning resolution, the description is affordable, independent residence for seniors. So that's the acronym that came with that. There's a big bump up, a significant bump up for in the floor area ratio, and there is also a bump up in allowable maximum height. There is no limit on the density of units. So there's considerable incentives to really driving development towards building for seniors. And they're, with various combinations with inclusionary housing or with quality housing, it's if you have the underlying financial support and the menu of uses works, it's the best way to be able to do it. I really feel sorry for all of you who are doing those financial models, because my head would spin. But I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and I think, just for examples, we're seeing folks incorporate that zoning tool and bring it into their program. And so they'll have a supportive housing building that maybe has a set aside for people who are 62 and older in order to access the zoning bump.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I know that the building code, the green building codes are about to be revised, and I'm wondering how people, we've already kind of been looking, we talked a little bit about some of the green and environmental passive house stuff that we might have been considering. There's been some pushback on underwriting because of the subsidies and land costs, but now that we're going to be moving into this era, I guess, where we're going to have more green requirements and it's not going to be optional, what are people thinking about adapting to that environment?
So the question is about the green building codes being revised and how we are adapting to that environment. Do you also mean financially? Yeah.
So I think on the financial side, if people are not going for full passive house, they're incorporating passive house elements. So those pieces of passive house, they do expect to be changed in the upcoming code. So on financially, I would encourage you, if you're looking at buildings, talk to your other lenders, not just the agencies. We are starting to see much more buy-in for incorporating lower utility costs than the M&O, and that actually really helps on the underwriting side because it means you can leverage more debt and sort of keep all costs more even.
Tony, do you want to say?
Yeah. Hey, Jay. It's. I think. I think that I'm repeating myself, but the code has really caught up and is pushing us all. I think we're lucky I don't know if this is just in New York City, New York State area, but I'd hope it's nationwide. But it's really headed in the right direction. We're doing more and more of the right thing. Having said that, a lot of the folks we're working with are not inclined necessarily to go to passive house because for financial reasons, it still is not working. So I don't know when that point will occur. I mean, I'm not saying in every respect, but just in general. In spite of that, the way our approach to the work that we're doing is still to push it as much as we can in that direction.
Okay, last question. Back there.
Hi. A little bit off topic, but I'm actually a community board member, and I was here because in our community we have kind of a unique possibility of some empty buildings, and we're trying to figure out as a community board how we can encourage for those buildings to become supportive housing or senior living.
Wow, I think that's music to everyone's ears here. You're going to have to tell us which community board you're from. But I will turn it to HPD for that.
Yes, I would love to talk to you more about that. You know, I think we are really interested in finding folks who are like you. And so, you know, I think we want to make sure that communities feel like this is an asset to their community. And so finding the right provider who can sort of fit in and work with your needs, we'd love to help connect you to some people.
We actually, I don't know if it's your community board or not, but we presented at a community board last week, something very similar. That community board is looking to take control of the process of in this case, shelters being sited in their neighborhoods. So they want to understand better what goes into the site selection from us and how we would operate a shelter and what kind of community benefits from the shelter there would be. Things like, is there a healthcare clinic or is there community meeting space, things like that. And really going from an organic process from the community board level up to the DHS level, not the other way around.
Well, I think this is the perfect, hopeful, happy note to end on. I want to thank you for spending the early afternoon with us. We hope that this panel was helpful for you. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. And have a great day. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you. Hi. Nice to meet you.